They called it a holy war. But holiness is rarely that expensive. When armies march with crosses painted on their shields, and merchants follow behind with ledgers in hand, you begin to wonder which one truly represents the heart of the crusade. The story begins, as so many do, with fear and promise. Fear of eternal damnation, promise of eternal reward. That combination can make people do anything, especially when those rewards are advertised like real estate in heaven. The church told peasants that their sins could be erased if they took up the sword for God. Nobles were told their debts could vanish too. And kings, well, they were told that God wanted them to expand his kingdom, which conveniently looked identical to their own ambitions. The Crusades were sold as a spiritual rescue mission, a noble effort to reclaim the Holy Land. But under that religious perfume was the stench of commerce and conquest. The Holy City was simply the most profitable excuse Europe had. Seen in centuries, the church needed money, the nobles needed land, and the restless knights needed purpose, or at least somewhere to aim their swords that wasn't home. Popes spoke like generals. They framed the Crusades as an act of salvation, a way to channel Europe's violence outward. It was clever. Turn civil unrest into foreign invasion, and you get both peace at home and plunder abroad. It was moral manipulation disguised as divine strategy. And it worked. Thousands answered the call not just out of faith, but out of hunger, poverty, and greed. After all, when a man with no bread is told he can eat in paradise if he kills in Palestine, morality becomes negotiable. The church called it the will of God, but God's will always seemed suspiciously aligned with the church's finances. Every crusade began with an indulgence, a spiritual bribe. Donate enough, and your sins disappeared. Kill enough, and your soul was clean. It was a theology that turned blood into currency. And while soldiers bled on desert sand, popes and bishops grew richer. They sold absolution like merchants sell spices. They declared wars in the name of Christ, then taxed the faithful to fund them. Religion became the first multinational corporation. Its product was salvation, and its customer base was the frightened poor. But it wasn't just the church. The kings of Europe saw opportunity too. Crusades gave them legitimacy, divine approval for imperial ambition. Seizing new land wasn't greed, it was piety. And what better justification for empire than God himself? Colonization before the word existed. Even ordinary citizens were swept into the current. The First Crusade began with chaos mobs of peasants marching east without supplies or training, believing miracles would feed them. What fed them instead were the bodies of others. They slaughtered Jewish communities across Europe on their way to the Holy Land. The irony of killing one branch of monotheism to liberate another was lost on them. That's the power of belief. It can make contradictions invisible. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem, the massacre was so total that blood reportedly reached their ankles. Priests led prayers over the corpses. They said God's will had been fulfilled. If there was ever a moment that revealed the dark heart of religious certainty, it was that one. A city soaked in blood, called holy because the right side had won. But even victory turned into politics. The newly conquered territories weren't run by saints, they were managed by nobles and merchants. Trade routes opened, taxes flowed, and the spoils of war funded new cathedrals back home. The church celebrated this as divine blessing, a reward for faith. Conveniently, God's blessings could always be measured in gold. Over the years, crusading became routine. Not a single great cause, but a recurring business model. When donations ran dry, a new crusade was declared. Sometimes against Muslims, sometimes against heretics, sometimes against fellow Christians. The label didn't matter. What mattered was momentum. Faith, like any market, needed demand. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, the mask had fallen off completely. The Crusaders didn't even make it to the Holy Land. They ransacked Constantinople, a Christian city, looting relics and treasures for God. It was theft baptized in prayer. The Church, of course, condemned the violence. After keeping its share of the spoils, religion has always been skilled at rebranding sin when it serves power. Killing became cleansing, greed became generosity, and conquest became communion. The psychological trick was simple: reframe self-interest as sacrifice. Tell a man his greed is God's plan, and he'll empty his conscience while filling his pockets. The Crusades weren't an accident of faith, they were a feature of it. When belief is absolute, accountability disappears. When heaven is the prize, anything becomes permissible. Faith grants moral immunity, the kind that turns compassion into conquest and love into loyalty to an institution. The psychology behind it is fascinating. People need meaning, especially when life feels uncertain or unjust. Religion provided a map, one that promised order in exchange for obedience. The Crusades weaponized that need. They gave desperate people a sacred cause, then redirected their anger toward a distant enemy. The same trick works today, just with different flags and slogans. The Church also understood the economics of fear. Fear of hell was profitable. Fear of the infidel was unifying. When you can define who the enemy is, you control who the faithful become. Crusades turned faith into identity, and identity into weaponry. Even language betrayed the illusion. Words like holy and righteous sanitized what was essentially organized theft. Cities burned, children starved, and people called it divine justice. They thought they were saving souls while they were really enriching empires. There's a strange beauty in how consistent it all is. From ancient temples to modern churches, the formula hasn't changed. Declare moral ownership of truth. Label doubt as sin. Collect loyalty through guilt. And when necessary, march in God's name to wherever the gold happens to be. The Crusades also reveal how faith thrives on contrast. You can't sell salvation without first manufacturing a threat. Heaven needs hell to stay in business. The Church needed enemies, pagans, heretics, Muslims, it didn't matter who. Without a villain, there's no audience for a saviour. And yet, beneath the armour and banners, most crusaders weren't monsters. They were ordinary men caught in an extraordinary illusion, believing they were instruments of good while serving a system that fed on their devotion. That's the quiet tragedy of blind faith. The Church told them they were chosen by God. But what kind of God needs men to kill for him? What kind of eternity depends on spilled blood? If morality needs a battlefield to prove itself, maybe it was never moral to begin with. Behind every crusade was a ledger, behind every prayer, a transaction, and behind every victory, a sermon to remind people that their suffering had purpose. That's how belief survives contradiction, by turning pain into proof. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The Crusades weren't the corruption of religion. They were its logical expression when given power. When a belief claims divine authority, violence becomes sacred economics. The Crusades didn't end when the armies came home. They simply changed uniforms. The spirit of them, the fusion of faith, fear, and finance, kept evolving, quietly shaping the foundations of European power. What had begun as holy war soon became holy business. The swords were eventually traded for contracts, but the motives stayed the same. After the bloodshed came administration. The Church, suddenly the owner of vast new lands, learned to think like an empire. It established orders of knights, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic, to protect pilgrims and manage territories. But these knights weren't just warriors, they were bankers, landlords, and diplomats. The Knights Templar, for example, created an early form of international banking. Pilgrims could deposit money in Europe and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem. A holy credit card, centuries before the first banknote. Religion had found a way to monetize devotion with unprecedented sophistication. It's fascinating how sanctity and accounting became inseparable. Every donation, every indulgence, every relic sold to fund another crusade blurred the line between faith and finance. The church claimed to save souls, yet it kept very careful records of who paid what. You could almost admire the efficiency. The Templars grew so rich and powerful that kings began to fear them. By the early 14th century, their downfall came not from battle, but from political jealousy. The French king, drowning in debt to the Templars, accused them of heresy, a convenient way to erase what he owed. They were arrested, tortured, and burned. Their wealth was seized. Once again, faith found a way to disguise theft as piety. God, it seemed, was always on the side of the creditors. Meanwhile, the church's influence stretched further. Crusading ideology was repurposed across Europe now against internal enemies. Heretics, witches, scholars, reformers, all branded as threats to divine order. The Inquisition was born from the same logic that justified the Crusades: obedience as virtue, doubt as sin. The battlefield simply moved inward from Jerusalem to the human mind, and yet the propaganda remained divine. The church spoke of love while perfecting systems of fear. It told the poor that suffering was noble while collecting taxes to decorate cathedrals. It promised salvation, then priced it like luxury housing. The Crusades taught religious institutions that controlling belief was more profitable than conquering land. Once you own the soul, the rest follows. Psychologically, the Crusades also revealed something uncomfortable about human nature. People crave meaning more than truth. When life is chaotic, belief provides direction, even if that direction leads off a cliff. The Crusades were a way to feel important, to belong to something cosmic. It wasn't just war, it was participation in a divine story. And when people feel part of a story that promises eternal reward, there's almost nothing they won't do. The leaders of the church understood this perfectly. They spoke of God, but they managed people. Every sermon, every proclamation was a tool of narrative control. Tell enough men that they are God's chosen, and they'll march into any desert. Tell them that doubt is betrayal, and they'll silence their conscience before their enemy. Faith became a form of hypnosis, comforting, total, and unbreakable. Even centuries later, we still use the same mental architecture. Every ideology that promises paradise, in this world or the next, inherits the Crusaders' blueprint. The certainty, the us versus them, the conviction that suffering for the cause is sacred, it's all there. The uniforms change, the flags change, but the logic stays. The Crusades were the rehearsal for the modern age. The trade routes opened by these holy wars shaped global history. Europe, once isolated, began to taste wealth from the East: spices, silk, science, ideas. Ironically, the wars fought to preserve religious purity ended up flooding Europe with foreign influence. The Crusaders brought back mathematics from the Muslim world, Aristotle from forgotten libraries, and debt as a system of empire. God's war, it turned out, was the midwife, capitalism. The irony is almost poetic. While popes thundered about purity, the aftermath of their wars birthed a new secular world. Commerce replaced crusading as the dominant religion. Merchants became the new priests, and profit became the new promise of salvation. The church eventually learned to baptize that too, blessing kings, crowning bankers, and sanctifying wealth as divine favor. The sword had done its job. Now the coin would carry the cross forward. Still, it's hard to ignore the human cost. Millions dead, generations displaced, entire cultures scarred, all in the name of a deity who never once intervened to stop it. The silence of heaven was deafening, but the noise of the marketplace filled the void. Faith demanded sacrifice, but business demanded results. The Crusades were the moment those two demands shook hands. People often romanticize those wars, imagining knights and banners and noble quests. But beneath the pageantry was something far simpler: economics dressed as faith. Kings needed money, the church needed control, knights needed legitimacy for violence, the peasantry needed purpose. God wills it was the slogan that made all these needs sound holy. Even the architecture of Europe tells the story. The cathedrals built with crusade money towered above the town's physical reminders of divine authority. But look closely, and you'll see that many of those cathedrals also doubled as banks, granaries, and trading centers. Holiness was always practical. The higher the spire, the deeper the vault. What makes the Crusades especially tragic isn't just the death, but the sincerity. Most of those who fought believed they were serving something pure. That's the most dangerous kind of deception, the one wrapped in virtue. When belief convinces you that morality is guaranteed by your side of the battlefield, evil becomes effortless. You don't have to think. You just have to obey. And obedience is profitable. It built cathedrals, funded kingdoms, and maintained hierarchies for centuries. When people believe that questioning authority is sin, authority never runs out of money. The Crusades proved that organized belief can turn morality into machinery. Once faith becomes policy, compassion becomes optional. The legacy still echoes today. Every time religion aligns itself with power, every time faith becomes a flag for politics, the crusading instinct reawakens. It may not wear armor now, but it still speaks the same language: moral certainty, divine purpose, chosen people, blessed wars. The vocabulary remains untouched. There's something profoundly human about it, our need to feel righteous, even when doing harm. The Crusades were not just wars of swords and sermons, they were mirrors of the human psyche. They showed how easily love of the divine can turn into hatred of the living. And yet, even after all the blood, the same idea persists: that violence can be holy, that wealth can be sacred, that God can be used as justification for greed. Maybe the true lesson of the Crusades isn't about history at all. Maybe it's about the limits of our own self-awareness. History remembers the Crusades as distant medieval events, dusty chapters in textbooks. But their structure, their moral architecture, never really disappeared. Every ideology that believes it has divine or moral monopoly inherits the same skeleton. The Crusades were simply the prototype, the first large-scale marketing campaign for moral supremacy. What made them so effective wasn't just faith, but the way faith was managed. Religion became bureaucracy. The church learned to turn spiritual language into political power. The words holy, sacred, and divine became licenses, not for peace, but for expansion. Behind the banners of Christ were tax systems, property laws, and political treaties. Behind every amen was an audit. God was no longer a mystery. He was an institution with an address. It's tempting to see that as corruption, but perhaps it's the natural evolution of belief. Once an idea gains followers, it begins to require infrastructure. Infrastructure needs money, and money always invites compromise. The Crusades didn't corrupt Christianity, they industrialized it. They transformed personal belief into collective machinery. Every mass movement that followed, political, national, ideological, used the same design. Convince people they're serving something eternal, and you can mobilize them to do almost anything. The tragedy is that so much beauty was built on suffering. The same faith that inspired soaring cathedrals and sublime art also justified centuries of slaughter. The same prayers whispered in comfort were shouted over the screams of cities on fire. It's a strange duality, how devotion can create both music and massacre. But perhaps they're not opposites at all. Both are attempts to touch the infinite, one through awe, the other through control. Those who led the Crusades weren't simply greedy, they were certain. And certainty is far more dangerous than greed. Greed wants gain. Certainty wants purity. Greed can be bargained with. Certainty cannot. The church didn't just want wealth, it wanted to own meaning itself, to define what was holy, what was just, what was real, and to question that was to risk damnation. That's not spirituality, that's monopoly on reality. It's easy to criticize medieval minds for falling for it, but the psychological mechanism is timeless. We all crave security. The idea that there's a single, absolute truth offers relief from chaos. The Crusades turned that relief into weaponry. When you believe your side holds the key to eternity, negotiation feels like betrayal. And that's how moral certainty becomes violence without hesitation. Even the propaganda was brilliant in its simplicity, they said the Muslims. We're desecrating holy sites, as if the creator of the universe needed bricks and stones defended by armies. But the narrative worked. It united fragmented kingdoms, distracted from internal corruption, and gave purpose to restless populations. The Crusades were an early form of crowd control, a moral spectacle that redirected rage outward. Every tyrant since has borrowed that trick. The economic side was equally calculated. The papacy sold indulgences, promised blessings, and issued loans. Even participation in a crusade was financially tiered. Pay enough, and you could send someone else to fight in your place, yet still receive the same heavenly reward. Faith outsourced like labor, and those who profited the most never had to touch a sword. The result was centuries of institutional dependence. The church became indispensable not because of divine truth, but because it owned the infrastructure of redemption. Need forgiveness? Pay the church. Need legitimacy? Get a papal blessing. Need soldiers? Declare a holy cause. Religion became the world's first subscription service, promising infinite reward for continuous renewal of loyalty. And yet, amid the horror, there were moments of strange humanity. Some crusaders, after seeing the devastation, began to question everything they'd been told. They met scholars from Islamic civilizations far more advanced than their own doctors, philosophers, mathematicians. Some even returned to Europe with books, not trophies. It was through those stolen ideas that Europe eventually awakened from its own darkness. Ironically, the wars meant to destroy heresy ended up importing knowledge that undermined religious authority itself. The Renaissance was born from the ashes of divine warfare. That's the cruel joke of history. Progress often crawls out of the wreckage of fanaticism. The same crusades that drenched the world in blood also cracked the armor of blind faith, just enough for reason to slip through. Knowledge travels quietly, even under banners of ignorance. Still, the cost was unbearable. Cities reduced to dust, cultures erased, countless innocents slaughtered in the name of a deity who never appeared. The silence of heaven was filled by the noise of priests justifying it. When prayers fail to stop suffering, dogma fills the gap. It's God's will, they said, as if fatalism could mask failure. And the people believed, because disbelief was too terrifying to face. To admit that heaven was silent would have meant that the killing was for nothing. But perhaps that's the deepest wound religion leaves: the inability to admit error. When faith becomes an identity, doubt feels like death. So the Crusades became mythologized instead of mourned. Songs were written, relics collected, saints invented. History was rewritten until the blood looked like glory. It's easier to romanticize the massacre than to accept that it was meaningless. Centuries later, we still inherit that myth. We still call them holy wars, as if the adjective redeems the noun. But holiness, if it means anything, should make violence impossible, not sacred. The Crusades proved the opposite, that once the word holy is attached to something, morality becomes optional. That's not devotion, that's moral anesthesia. It's strange to think how the same faith that preaches love could sanctify so much cruelty. But religion has always been adaptable. It can bless kings and comfort beggars, justify peace and command war, condemn greed and collect wealth, sometimes in the same sentence. That flexibility is its genius and its danger. The Crusades weren't a malfunction. They were a demonstration of how belief can wear any costume. What the Crusades ultimately exposed was the human capacity to believe two opposite things at once: to pray for mercy while swinging a sword, to love one's enemy while burning his city, to worship a God of peace through organized killing. It's an ancient paradox that still breathes today, just with better technology. What lingers after the Crusades isn't the glory, it's the pattern. The pattern of moral justification welded to ambition, of belief turned into bureaucracy, of people surrendering their conscience because an authority claimed to speak for the divine. That pattern didn't end with the medieval age. It simply evolved into different uniforms and languages. When we study the Crusades, we tend to focus on the banners and the blood, but their true power lay in narrative. They taught institutions how to frame power as virtue. They made conquest sound like charity. Every sermon before a battle, every prayer before a siege, served as moral camouflage. Even the chroniclers, the historians of their time, were church scribes, editing reality through the lens of faith. History, like theology, was curated, and the myth was born that violence, under the right slogan, could be sacred. And once a story becomes sacred, it becomes untouchable. Question it, and you're not just wrong, you're wicked. That's how the church kept its grip for so long. Not through miracles, but through monopoly on meaning. The Crusades were not only fought on foreign soil, they were fought in the minds of believers. Convince people that obedience equals virtue, and they'll chain themselves. It's hard not to notice how similar that psychology feels to modern life. Replace Holy Land with national interest. Replace infidels with enemies of freedom, and the structure is identical. The same righteous vocabulary, just polished with different grammar. The Crusader's armor has become a suit. The priest's blessing has become a press release. But the moral confidence, that chilling certainty, remains the same. What's most unsettling is that the Crusades worked because they exploited the best parts of human nature: loyalty, courage, sacrifice, love for something greater. Those are noble instincts, but when they're hijacked by authority, they become weapons. The knights weren't evil men, they were manipulated men. They wanted purpose, and they were sold one. Faith didn't cure their fear, it redirected it. The average crusader didn't understand geopolitics or theology. He understood the promise of redemption. He believed that marching east could fix what was broken inside him. That's the quiet cruelty of belief. It turns personal guilt into political obedience. Instead of healing, people were told to prove their virtue through violence. And when the killing was done, the guilt returned deeper, darker, demanding another crusade to silence it. You see that same psychological loop everywhere religion rules. Sin creates fear. Fear creates obedience. Obedience empowers the institution that defines sin in the first place. It's a perfect economy, powered by guilt, sustained by ignorance. The Crusades were simply the most spectacular advertisement for that system. Even today, fragments of that medieval logic linger. We still build monuments to heroes who died in just wars, as though morality were defined by who wrote the victory speech. We still bless armies before they march. We still use God, or justice, or freedom as perfume for political decay. Every empire believes it's on a divine mission. The only difference between the Crusaders and us is branding. But let's not forget the other side of that story. The Islamic civilizations that the Crusaders fought were, in many ways, far more advanced. They had hospitals, libraries, and universities, while Europe still believed disease was divine punishment. The so-called infidels preserved Greek philosophy, developed algebra, mapped the stars. The Crusaders came with swords. They left with ideas they could barely understand. And centuries later, Europe called that rebirth. They named it the Renaissance, as if the light came from within rather than from the people they once called godless. It's hard to ignore the irony. The same wars fought to defend Christianity ended up importing the knowledge that weakened it. The same church that condemned reason ended up sponsoring art and science inspired by cultures it once tried to destroy. History loves its jokes, and this one was cosmic. But the joke turns bitter when you realize how much could have been spared. How many minds, how many lives, how many generations were lost so that institutions could prove they spoke for an invisible power. The Crusades were a monument to wasted devotion to human potential, sacrificed on the altar of certainty, and yet we still romanticize them. We see movies where knights in shining armor ride under divine banners, their motives pure, their hearts noble. It's comforting, isn't it, to imagine that moral clarity ever existed, but the real world has never been that simple. Even then, morality was negotiated in counting houses and papal courts. Every crusade had sponsors, donors, investors, a network of holy accountants. The battlefield was only the visible part. The real war was fought over profit margins and influence. The church learned early that sin is profitable, but guilt is priceless. A guilty man can be controlled forever. That's why absolution was never free. It's why indulgences were sold like lottery tickets to heaven. And it's why the same church that preached humility built palaces of marble. Holiness had become luxury branding. The cross was the logo. At its core, the Crusades revealed something deeply human, our talent for self-deception, the ability to turn cruelty into duty, greed into grace, fear into faith. It's the same alchemy that powers every form of fanaticism. The tools change, the banners fade, but the impulse that need to sanctify our own violence remains. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Crusades. Not the empires they built or the borders they drew, but the blueprint they left behind, a guidebook for how to turn belief into business and business into morality, a manual for how to wage war with a clean conscience. The Crusades weren't just wars fought long ago. They were a rehearsal for how faith and power would dance for the next 1,000 years. The choreography never changed. One provides the halo, the other provides the sword. Together, they make destruction look divine. When the last Crusader kingdoms fell, the church didn't mourn. It adapted. It realized it could command the same devotion without the expense of armies. The wars of the future would be fought in minds, not deserts. Control the story, and you control the soul. The church became an expert in that kind of warfare. every altar a pulpit, every pulpit a parliament. What's haunting is how natural that control feels to people. When belief is inherited, it doesn't feel like obedience, it feels like identity. A man who sees himself as a soldier of God doesn't think he's controlled, he thinks he's chosen. That's the genius of indoctrination. It replaces submission with purpose. The Crusades thrived on that illusion. Every believer thought he was defending God, when, in reality, he was defending those who claimed to represent him. The system thrived because it gave everyone a role. The church preached that salvation needed financing. The knights found meaning in violence. The peasants found hope in promises of paradise. Everyone had something to gain or lose. That's how ideology becomes unbreakable. It doesn't rely on truth, it relies on investment. Even centuries later, that same mechanism fuels the machinery of modern belief. The details are different, the weapons more sophisticated, the language cleaner, but the structure identical. People still march, convinced their cause is moral because it has a sacred symbol attached. It's comforting to think we've evolved past it. But moral certainty is still the most addictive drug humans have ever created. When people say the Crusades were of their time, they forget that time doesn't erase psychology. The same needs that drove them, the hunger for belonging, the fear of death, the longing for moral simplicity, are still alive. We just baptize them in different names. Nationalism, ideology, progress. Each one claims the moral high ground. Each one promises redemption, and each one quietly collects a price. The truth is, religion didn't invent human greed or cruelty. It just gave them permission. It sanctified them, dressed them in ritual, and called them virtues. Faith made ego eternal, and once ego believes it's eternal, it stops learning. That's why the Crusades were inevitable. Once any group believes it owns truth, every other becomes expendable. The propaganda of holiness has always been effective because it speaks to our deepest fear that life might be meaningless. Promise people eternal significance, and they'll trade away reason for it. The Crusades turned that trade into policy. They showed the world how easily moral language can be weaponized. Every empire that followed, from colonial Europe to ideological revolutions, inherited that script. Replace the word God with destiny, freedom, or civilization, and the pattern fits perfectly. It's strange how invisible that pattern becomes when we're part of it. The Crusaders didn't think of themselves as villains. No one ever does. They believed history would remember them as heroes. And in a way, it did. The victors always get the luxury of righteousness. The losers become footnotes. The dead become statistics. And the blood becomes metaphor. That's how morality survives atrocity, through selective memory. But history has a way of whispering the truth, even through centuries of sermons. Letters from Crusaders tell stories of confusion, regret, disillusionment. Men who left their homes, thinking they were saving the world, ended up questioning the God who demanded it. Some even deserted, realizing the holy cause was little more than organized plunder. Those moments, small, human, terrified, are what remain honest amid the noise of glory. And yet, those stories are rarely told. Because honesty doesn't sell, certainty does. The same certainty that promised heaven to those who killed for it. The same certainty that built empires and called them divine. The same certainty that still whispers, in quieter tones today, that morality belongs to those who believe. But perhaps the real heresy isn't doubt, it's honesty. To look at the Crusades and admit that faith, however sincere, can become machinery for greed, that the people who burned cities thought they were saving them, that the priests who blessed the killing believed they were doing good. There's no comfort in that truth, but there is freedom in it. Because once you see how easily belief becomes business, you begin to understand the real cost of holiness. It's not just lives lost, but minds surrendered. The Crusades remind us that morality isn't safe in the hands of institutions, especially those that claim to speak for eternity. The moment goodness becomes property, corruption is inevitable. Still, there's a quiet beauty in the irony. Those wars meant to glorify God ended up exposing man, his hunger, his arrogance, his longing for certainty. And maybe that's why the story of the Crusades still matters. Not as a tale of faith or conquest, but as a mirror, because in it we see ourselves, our need to believe, our capacity to destroy in the name of goodness, our desperate search for meaning in the silence of the universe. The banners have faded, the swords have rusted, but the mindset that forged them still hums quietly in the background of civilization. Every time we divide the world into the righteous and the damned, every time we mistake conviction for truth, every time we sanctify ambition with moral language, we replay the same old crusade, just with better lighting. So maybe the question isn't whether the Crusades were holy or profitable. Maybe they were simply human to human, a reflection of what happens when fear of meaninglessness meets the promise of divine reward. A bargain we keep making, century after century, hoping the next crusade will finally make us pure. And perhaps that's the strangest part, how easily the divine can be priced. The Crusades were sold like a heavenly investment plan. Pay now, repent later, and secure a permanent plot in paradise. The church turned faith into currency long before any nation minted coins. Each sword swung in Christ's name was another tithe collected, another promise written in spiritual credit. The papacy discovered something extraordinary. During those years, salvation could be monetized. Indulgences weren't just forgiveness slips. They were the first spiritual business model. A sinner could purchase absolution and in doing so, finance the next campaign. You could spill blood on the battlefield or gold into the coffers, both led to the same reward, at least on paper. It's hard to decide which was more efficient, the killing or the accounting. Behind the holy rhetoric stood a surprisingly practical infrastructure. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa turned piety into profit. They provided ships, weapons, and logistics not out of devotion, but for a share of the spoils. Holy war made excellent commerce. Crusaders paid for passage, supplies, and credit lines. And when Constantinople fell, it wasn't God who collected the treasury, it was the merchants. In a sense, faith provided the advertising, and business handled distribution. The church didn't mind. It got what it wanted: influence, obedience, and the illusion of unity. The merchants got ports, the nobles got loot, and the peasants got graves, along with a sermon explaining why that was noble. Religion has always depended on this division of labour. One group believes, another profits, and both are convinced the arrangement is moral. There's something hauntingly modern about that dynamic. Every age finds its own way to wrap exploitation in moral fabric. The medieval priest promised heaven. The modern marketer promises fulfillment. Both understand the same secret. People will pay almost anything to feel that their lives matter. The church simply perfected the technique first. And when things went wrong, as they often did, theology was there to patch the holes. If a crusade failed, it was God's test. If it succeeded, it was God's will. A system that can explain any outcome is invincible, because it never risks being wrong. Believers march to their deaths under a logic that couldn't be falsified. That's how belief becomes armor. It deflects evidence instead of absorbing it. The human cost of that armor was staggering. When Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, They slaughtered Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians indiscriminately. Chronicles from both sides describe streets running with blood, temples set ablaze, bodies piled in sanctuaries. The victors prayed in the same churches they'd turned into graveyards, and through it all, they believed they were doing good. That's perhaps the most frightening part, that goodness itself can become violent when it stops questioning. The church didn't invent the violence, it simply gave it divine authorization. Once you baptize a sword, it no longer feels like a weapon, it feels like a calling. That's what made the Crusades so enduring. They weren't fought only on battlefields. They lived inside minds. A holy war doesn't end when the armies disband. It lingers in the way people see others, the way they justify suffering, the way they confuse obedience for virtue. And the irony is that the Crusades never truly achieved their stated goal. The Holy Land remained contested. The supposed enemies of Christ weren't defeated, only multiplied. But the Church's real success wasn't territorial, it was psychological. It created generations of believers willing to sacrifice everything for an abstract cause. It taught millions that violence could be sanctified if performed with the right banner, and it proved that faith could survive any moral contradiction as long as doubt was treated as sin. If you read letters from ordinary crusaders, you can hear that tension. Some write of homesickness, others of fear, guilt, or confusion. There are lines where men wonder if God really wanted all this blood, but those doubts rarely survived. Confession, absolution, and camaraderie quickly silence them. Religion is brilliant at drowning hesitation with ritual. When surrounded by believers, disbelief feels like betrayal. That's how entire populations can move as one, not through force, but through shared illusion. The Crusades weren't sustained by cruelty alone, but by community. Every man believed, his neighbour believed. The echo of conviction is louder than conviction itself. It's why even those who saw the absurdity kept marching. To stop was to stand alone against God and friend alike. And that's the same mechanism that still shapes societies today. Whether it's religion, ideology, or nationalism, the pattern repeats. Convince people that doubt equals treason, and you've built an army that polices itself. You no longer need swords. Guilt will do the work. The Church understood that long before psychology existed as a science. What we often miss when studying the Crusades is that they weren't an exception, they were a prototype. The first large-scale fusion of faith, economy, and propaganda. Every later empire, religious or secular, followed the blueprint. Find a moral narrative, identify an enemy, promise salvation through conquest, and the rest takes care of itself. The Crusades weren't a medieval anomaly. They were the business plan for civilization as we know it. Even the word crusade survived, repurposed for political and commercial slogans. We have crusades against poverty, drugs, disease, each one a sanitized echo of the original. The word still carries moral weight because we still crave that sense of righteousness. We want to believe our causes are more than interests. We want them to be sacred. But sacredness is a dangerous currency. Once an idea becomes holy, it stops being negotiable. Dialogue becomes heresy. Compromise becomes sin. That's how the medieval mindset never truly died. It just changed its wardrobe. Today we fight just wars, defensive operations, missions of freedom. Different names, same faith in moral superiority. If the Crusades teach anything, it's that humans are experts at disguising ambition as virtue. The Church didn't need to lie outright. It just needed to tell half-truths loud enough to drown the rest. And once people are convinced they're on the side of good, they'll do anything. Because good people, in their own eyes, can't be evil. The tragedy isn't that people believed. It's that belief made them certain. Certainty has always been the real enemy of understanding. It kills curiosity, replaces empathy with judgment, and turns the unknown into the unwanted. The Crusades were certainty with a sword, and the echo of that certainty still shapes our world every time someone divides humanity into the saved and the damned. Maybe that's why this story still feels personal, because in some quiet way, we're all tempted by the same comfort to believe we're right, that our values are pure, that our version of truth deserves to triumph. The Crusades weren't monsters in armor, they were people, desperate for meaning, intoxicated by moral clarity. That's why history keeps repeating them. After the final crusading banners fell, something remarkable happened. Europe didn't lose faith, it industrialized it. The same machinery that once sent men to die in deserts was quietly repurposed to build cathedrals, finance monarchs, and colonize continents. The church may have lost Jerusalem, but it gained the world. The Crusades had shown what belief could do when properly organized. Faith wasn't just a personal conviction anymore, it was infrastructure. Roads, trade routes, shipping networks, all expanded under the glow of holy intent. The same knights who once fought for God became landlords, merchants, and bankers. The line between sanctity and commerce blurred until they were indistinguishable. Money changed hands faster than prayers. Venetian merchants, who once ferried soldiers to the Holy Land, became the silent winners of the crusading era. They learned that faith moves people, and people move goods. Religion had globalized trade before. Globalization had a name. Every relic, every holy site, every pilgrimage was a market in disguise. Even the relic trade thrived like a medieval stock exchange. Fragments of the true cross, splinters of saintly bones, drops of holy blood, each one certified by a priest, priced by a bishop, and purchased by believers who thought they were buying eternity. The irony was sharp. Salvation became a collectible. Faith, once free, had become an industry. The church didn't hide it. It blessed the transactions, taxed the merchants, and preached about generosity as long as it flowed upward. To question that system was heresy, not because it threatened God, but because it threatened revenue. When holiness becomes a commodity, doubt becomes theft. That's what made the Crusades so profitable long after the fighting stopped. They had converted morality into economy. The holy business wasn't about Jerusalem anymore. It was about maintaining power through the illusion of purpose. And the illusion worked perfectly. People will tolerate inequality, poverty, and suffering if they believe those things serve a divine plan. The genius of that plan was psychological. Religion offered structure to a chaotic world. It turned fear into duty, pain into purpose, and death into graduation. The Crusades capitalized on that emotional currency. They turned existential anxiety into manpower. Every man who felt small in life could feel infinite in death. It's hard to compete with that kind of marketing. The psychological mechanism was simple. People want certainty more than truth. Certainty feels safe. Truth feels fragile. And when certainty wears a halo, it becomes irresistible. That's what kept the crusading spirit alive long after the last battle ended. It found new homes in colonization, in empire, in ideology. Every civilizing mission was just a crusade with better branding. Europe learned that the language of salvation could justify anything. Conquest became conversion. Slavery became stewardship. Exploitation became God's will. The template remained untouched. Dress ambition in moral language, and even cruelty can look like compassion. The church may not have wielded every sword, but it blessed enough of them to stay indispensable. Meanwhile, science and philosophy began to rise quietly in the background, asking uncomfortable questions. But even the thinkers who doubted divine authority couldn't escape its shadow. Their universities were funded by the same church that burned heretics. Knowledge advanced, but always under watchful eyes. The world was waking up, but it was still half dreaming in incense. The Crusades had left more than ruins and relics. They had left a habit, the habit of moral justification, the belief that power, if cloaked in virtue, is innocent. That's why even modern nations still use moral theatre to sell violence. We call it defence, justice, liberation. It's the same structure, just with different flags. And underneath it all, the psychology hasn't changed. The same desire for certainty, the same fear of insignificance, the same willingness to kill or die for an idea that promises meaning. Humans haven't outgrown the crusading impulse. We've just rebranded it. The weapons are smarter, the slogans cleaner, the consequences global. The church's legacy isn't the cathedrals or the scriptures, it's the method. How to turn faith into obedience. How to turn obedience into control. And how to make that control feel voluntary. That's what the Crusades perfected. It wasn't just a war for land. It was a war for the human mind, and that war never ended. It continues in subtler ways now, not with swords and banners, but with institutions, ideologies, and algorithms. Each promises a version of salvation, safety, order, identity. Each demands loyalty in return. The forms evolve, but the structure remains sacred. We still kneel only now. The altars glow with screens instead of candles. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy of human progress. We built machines, cities, and networks, but we never learned to outgrow our hunger for faith. We still look for someone or something to tell us we're right, we're special, we're chosen. The Crusades just gave that hunger a uniform and called it holy. Some historians argue that the Crusades shaped the modern West, that they opened trade, spread ideas, and unified Europe. Maybe so, but it's worth asking, at what cost? Every step of progress was paved with corpses, every sermon on virtue funded by suffering. The irony is almost unbearable. A religion preaching peace became the architect of centuries of conflict. And the Church still calls that era glorious. Holy wars, sacred missions, divine purpose. It's easier to romanticize bloodshed than to admit you built your empire on it. Memory can be rewritten when your priests are your historians. But not every voice was silenced. There were monks who wrote of disillusionment, knights who abandoned their vows, citizens who questioned why God needed so much gold. Their words, though buried, survive in fragments. Quiet testimonies of conscience, proof that even in an age of blind devotion, some still saw the light without needing it to come from a cross. The Crusades are long over, but their ghosts linger in language, politics, and faith itself. Every time someone claims divine approval for destruction, that old spirit stirs. Every time morality becomes a transaction, it whispers again. Maybe that's the true inheritance of the Crusades, not faith, not land, not relics, but the eternal partnership between belief and power. And the question that remains isn't, why did they fight? It's, why do we still need to? Because as long as humans fear the void more than they love truth, there will always be another crusade waiting to begin. What's striking is that the Crusades didn't just expose the corruption of religion, they revealed something deeper, something more uncomfortable about us. That beneath the grand cathedrals and banners, faith is often just a reflection of human need, the need to belong, to be right, to feel safe in a vast and indifferent universe. Strip away the rituals and the symbols, and what remains is that hunger. It's not evil, it's just unexamined. Religion didn't invent it, it simply learned how to feed it and charge admission. The Crusades were not just a clash of civilizations, they were a mirror. On one side, Christians claiming divine destiny, on the other, Muslims defending sacred ground. Both convinced they were chosen, both sure the other was blind, both praying to the same sky, certain that heaven picked a side. The wars were less about God and more about who got to speak in His name. That's the tragedy of belief when it solidifies into authority. Once people think they own the truth, everyone else becomes an intruder. Every empire, every church, every ideology has played that same melody just in different keys. It's always us, the enlightened, against them, the lost. In the Crusades, that logic reached its purest form. The church told people they were part of a story bigger than themselves, a cosmic struggle, a war of good and evil. And who doesn't want to be on the side of good? But the moment you divide the world that way, every cruelty becomes justified. Evil stops being something within us and becomes something we destroy in others. That's how faith becomes violence, without ever realizing it's changed shape. And the strange part is, even when religion fades, the habit remains. Political movements, revolutions, ideologies all borrow the same sacred structure. They promise salvation, demand sacrifice, and condemn unbelievers. We've replaced infidels with enemies of progress, but the tone is identical. Humanity seems addicted to moral theatre. We'd rather die for a meaning than live without one. The Crusades simply industrialized that addiction. They showed rulers how to weaponize moral certainty. They taught priests that obedience disguised as piety can move mountains and armies. And they taught ordinary people that suffering, when sanctified, can feel like glory. It's an incredible psychological trick. Turn pain into virtue, and people will endure anything. What's terrifying is how willingly they did. Pilgrims marched across continents, starving, diseased, broken, all because someone promised them eternity. The church understood that the body can be exhausted, but hope cannot, so it sold hope. Not cheaply, either. Each crusader financed his salvation with coin, blood, or both. The divine economy was booming, and when the wars failed, as they often did, the faithful didn't turn against the system. They turned against themselves. They said they hadn't believed enough, hadn't prayed enough, hadn't sacrificed enough. That's how powerful faith can be. It never blames its architects, only its followers. The church didn't need to prove its claims. It only needed to convince people that doubt was weakness. That's how religion survives collapse. It transforms defeat into devotion. The Crusades, disastrous as they were, didn't destroy Christianity. They fortified it. The narrative was rewritten. We suffered for God, therefore we are holy. The blood became proof of faith, not evidence of failure. It's the same logic that keeps toxic systems alive. The worse the results, the more people cling to them, because admitting error feels like losing meaning. And maybe that's the heart of it. Religion doesn't just offer answers, it offers insulation from uncertainty. The Crusades were fueled by that insulation. No one wanted to face the possibility that the world was chaotic, that morality wasn't written in stone, that justice might not have a divine author. It's easier to believe there's a plan, even a violent one, than to accept that meaning is something we must create ourselves. The people who organized those wars understood that psychology perfectly. Popes like Urban II and Innocent III knew how to frame a message, that suffering could be sacred, that dying could be holy, that loyalty to God could excuse everything. And they were right, not theologically, but strategically. Convince someone their pain has purpose and you own them. But not everyone bought it. There were thinkers, poets, and ordinary people who saw through the illusion. They questioned why God needed soldiers. They noticed how the powerful seemed to benefit most from divine commands. They saw how the poor paid for the sins of the rich, in both money and blood. Those voices were rare, often punished, but they mattered. Because even then, the cracks were showing. Maybe that's why, in the centuries that followed, Europe slowly began to wake up. The Renaissance wasn't just an artistic rebirth. It was the beginning of moral self-awareness. People started to realize that truth didn't need a priest to authorize it, that morality might exist without miracles, that perhaps, just perhaps, the divine was not a commander, but a metaphor. The Crusades didn't just expose the church's corruption, they accidentally planted the seed of doubt. The more people saw how religion could justify horror, the more they began to question whether it should justify anything at all. The same faith that united them in war eventually divided them in thought. And that division, painful, heretical, liberating, became the first step toward intellectual independence. It's poetic, really. 1,000 years ago, people marched east to conquer the Holy Land. And somewhere along the way, they started conquering the idea of holiness itself. Still, the echoes of that old mindset remain. We may no longer fight in God's name, but we still fight in the name of moral certainty. We still mistake conviction for truth. We still think those who disagree are less human, less worthy, less enlightened. The armor has changed, but the impulse hasn't. We keep reinventing the crusade because we haven't yet learned how to live without enemies. Maybe that's what the Crusades can still teach us, not about faith, but about fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of being wrong. Fear that without a divine story, our lives might not matter. That fear is what built empires, burned cities, and sanctified slaughter. And it still builds things today, softer, cleaner, more sophisticated forms of obedience. The lesson isn't to hate religion, but to see through it. To understand how easily belief becomes business, how quickly morality becomes merchandise. To recognize that holiness isn't proof of goodness sometimes, it's camouflage. Because if we can see that, if we can finally learn to separate meaning from mythology, maybe the next generation won't need another crusade to feel significant. Maybe we can learn to stand in the uncertainty, to find wonder not in being chosen, but in being alive. And that would be something truly holy. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what's your take on all this? I'd really like to know.